from the Ministry of Health, though, sets out that there were 283 requests for an exemption to the conditions of isolation having been received by the 30th of April, that 24 exemptions were sought in cases where a relative was dying or close to dying, of which 18 were granted. So that does suggest that there has been due consideration. That is advice I've received from the Ministry of Health, but I'm sure that they'll be reflecting on this judgment.
Given the High Court has overturned this one, does that call to question at all, I guess, the legal basis under which these decisions are being made?
I think reading the judgment, it suggests that actually it was the sense that it was whether or not the individual circumstances were taken into account rather than an automated process having been applied. Now really my expectation is that the Ministry of Health will look at that judgment and then assess the way that they're being applying the policy in the future. I'll just pan over. Bernard, you had a question.
Prime Minister, what's your view on public-private partnerships like the Transmission Gully one, and whether they should be used for all the big projects that are planned in the years ahead, given what's happened to the Gully?
Yeah, well, look, we, of course, have seen a role for public-private partnerships in transport projects, but again, we take each on case by case. You'll see that we haven't applied that same logic on some other projects, particularly within our correction system. So for us, it really does depend on the form of infrastructure, the long-term arrangements and governance arrangements. I'd also note, of course, that we're working through with Transmission Gullies, scaling back up their operation post-level 4, and that's something that we're having to work through with the contractors at the moment.
Are you Minister, though, will bail out and dump the mess on the government?
Of course, we would certainly hope that would not be the case, but I'll leave the Ministry of Transport to continue to work through some of the issues on the ground. I'll come back to you, Jessica.
Prime Minister, last week when we asked you about universities and paying the full amount for accommodation, you said to act with compassion. We've had just one example of a student where they're paying full amount for their room and also contributing to where they're staying at home with their mum, so they're having to pay rent twice. Are you looking to do anything, or can you compel universities to act?
The Ministry of Education has intervened here, and rightly so, and are seeking to try and mediate a solution. One of the tricky issues is that universities often will have different arrangements for the delivery of their halls of residence. Some, for instance, are privately contracted. Some have access, for instance, the wage subsidy, and we would have a very clear expectation in those cases of how they should be behaving. But there is a role for the government to try and sort this issue out, because it will seem patently unfair to many people.
And
then I'll come back to you, Henry.
Are you comfortable that nurses at Waitakere Hospital say their concerns were not listened to by management, they felt ignored and bullied, and as a result patients on a virus-free ward have been put at risk?
I did see those reports, and it is never acceptable for anyone who is a public servant to feel bullied anywhere, and I especially would include at this time where if there are concerns, people need to feel they can freely raise them. I have seen the protocols that are being applied and questions that were raised over PPE, which they had access to, but there were questions over whether it was the right PPE. The DHB have undertaken to look at that, and I'll certainly be asking the Director General of the outcome of that.
Something clearly went wrong, didn't it? 57 frontline health workers have had to be stood down at this very critical time.
So, as I understand, advice and the view of the DHB and their technical advisory team was that nurses could not move between wards if they were working on a shift with COVID patients, but that they could work on different wards on different shifts, but never at the same time. That was the view of the DHB, and that is what is being applied here. I believe the Director General is working with the DHB to work through what has happened in this case and make sure that we're following the best advice possible.
Prime Minister, on tourism, there's been a bit of a suggestion from some, including Cameron Baggery, that school holidays could be massively shifted to kind of even out the peaks and troughs for the tourism industry. So instead of the entire country having 2 weeks to go down to Queenstown, it's staggered over several months. Has the government considered anything like that at this point, and could you see that working?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things to consider is that is a reasonable exercise for the Ministry of Education, but I don't want to be too quick to give a response, given that it's actually something that for the Minister of Education really to respond to directly and to talk through all of the issues that may come with.
Prime Minister, some public health experts have said that they don't believe the Ministry of Health is listening to Māori health experts and responding to that. Associate Health Minister Penny Hinari said, yes, we've had this conversation with both John Whanga, Dr. Bloomfield, and my colleagues, including the Prime Minister, that this needs to change and it needs to change urgently. What is the government changing, if anything, to include those Māori health experts more in the decision making?
Yeah, well, one thing I would just add, and I don't think this has been in the conversation enough, and I know Minister Hinare will agree with this, that actually we are, as you'll hear from my answers, really leaning on the DHBs to be delivering on the ground. They're the ones setting up the testing protocols within their rural and isolated communities. They're the ones that need to identify whether they have those connections into marae and with our more vulnerable Māori population. And helpfully, they are DHBs now that have more Māori representation than they have ever had. Māori have a seat at the decision-making table at a local level for the way our COVID response is run and managed, and I really want to make sure those voices are being heard, not just in the Ministry of Health.
Are there enough Māori voices and Māori people at the table? That Minister Hinari indicated that we're not even close to having enough Māori at that decision-making table across the board.
Oh, well, when it comes to the expert advice, listening to epidemiologists, and I do rely on the Ministry of Health to bring together that expertise. And they know our expectation that that will include a wide variety of voices. They know we have an expectation, for instance, that within our testing, that we have reached out into those Māori communities. And they know our expectation that we use, for instance, our whānau order navigators and all of the resource we have on the ground. We will keep driving for that, though. We will have a chance to review it whether or not in the future we've done everything we could have done to work with Māori to the best of our ability.
Prime Minister,
Just a couple more.
Would New Zealand add its name to the calls for Taiwan to join the WHO fully? And would we consider welcoming it to our Trans-Tasman bubble if indeed we are successful in creating it?
Look, we haven't given any consideration beyond working on the Trans-Tasman bubble. We have to make sure that whatever we do it well, that we get it right, that we maintain the achievements that we've had to date. When it comes to wider matters relating to the WHO, I absolutely maintain that the most important thing is for us as a global community to reflect in its totality what happened domestically, what happened internationally, the WHO response and our response collectively. There will be things to learn. This is a 1 in 100 year event. It would be crazy to suggest we wouldn't look back at those key learnings. When it comes to membership issues, though, that's just something I wouldn't want to comment on here and now. Down the back, and then I'll come back to you, Bernard, then down the back, and then we'll wrap up.
Have you sent a present to Boris Johnson and his new baby son?
Not yet. But I will note that actually we did get a lovely, from Theresa May, a lovely number 10 onesie for Neve when she arrived, so we'll be making sure that we reciprocate. We have had a small exchange, though, over the arrival of his baby boy, in which Nurse Jenny prompted another mention by the Prime Minister, so obviously she remains top of his mind.
Prime Minister, can the tourism industry start preparing under level 2 to have domestic tourism?
Look, I know that is incredibly important to domestic tourism. I know that that's something that they're hoping to see. I'll be announcing on Thursday what that alert level framework looks like. You'll remember that, of course, we've designed the framework, put that out for publication at the beginning of our COVID response. It's been our practice to then go back, look at our current situation, what we've learnt since that time, and make any adjustments based on a public health response. So that will put out on Thursday, but it is fair to say I have heard not only the tourism industry, but also those who are being separated regionally from family and friends. So we will be weighing all of those issues up. Ben, and then down the back, and then we'll conclude.
Just a question about job losses, because we know there are going to be some. Obviously, we'll try and prevent them. But for the people that do lose their jobs, what services, how are you gearing up to support these people with, mental health support services or like arm around the shoulder type government stuff?
And providing employment services, very active labour markets will be a key part of our response. That is something you will have seen from the last budget. We put an extra, from memory, 270 MSD staff into work and income because we felt we had lost that active approach to supporting people into employment. We've already put in place a service, employment centres services, which put employers and employees directly in contact with one another. And there are examples of where, for instance, the Ministry of Primary Industries have been working with the MSD to place, for instance, people in the tourism sector into the horticultural sector. We need more of that, and that will be part of our plans going forward. Yep.
Is 2 weeks one incubation period of COVID-19, is that long enough to really figure out whether there's community transmission that may have been re-sparked by something like the parties on the weekend?
Yeah, a good question, and it essentially does give us a minimum amount of time, but does give us data that should demonstrate what's happening with transmission when we've opened up and created more contact with people. So not only does that need to sit us alongside our proactive testing, and you will have heard us talk about the results of that, it also then gives us a sense more generally of people's interaction and the impact of that. Essentially, epidemiologists obviously suggest it's a minimum, and many have argued for more.
Okay, can I just ask a
So, very, very last
quick
one.
stuff on Hita's question, actually.
Yeah.
In regards to Māori experts,
Yeah.
isn't it a fair point to make that they want to be at the table and not just at a DHB level? Because we know that this has been treated with a more nationalised approach.
Yeah.
And both yourself and Dr. Ashley Bloomfield have talked at length about the fact that Māori are the most vulnerable to this. So
Yeah.
why not have a Māori expert there with you?
I guess what I would dispute is that that voice hasn't been present. Right, thank you.